Hello everyone, today we talk about the Duchy of Carinthia for our historical regions series. We've never talked about Carinthia, I think, in general, if not in those videos about southeastern Germany, the Habsburgic Erbländer for the early modern, say, Habsburgic history series. From a chronological point of view, we start from the end, because there was Carinthia, that was the mark of Carinthia, and these are foundational passages in the history, of course, not just of the Carinthian Duchy, but in fact of Carinthian history, culture, identity. Right, so those are very interesting passages that I prefer to observe in separate videos. If anything, the mark of Carinthia was something more in between, but Carinthia especially is a Slavic polity that deserves, in fact, its really deep observation for this south, what would become, like during the Ostsiedlung, a southeast German territory. There is some kind of Germano-Slavic identity at large. We will have to talk also about Carniola, Slovenia. And you know that we have already covered some polities around, not just, we made Styria, we talked Tyrol, Friuli. If anything, we have to cover Istria. It is, however, a bit less of a neatly defined, at least, politically active region, but it's also very interesting just as a frontier area. We talked about the Pannonian Slavs, we talked about the Duchy of Croatia, so there is a lot going on here that really is often neglected, and that I'm glad on Schwerpunkt to have started covering to a degree. Now, the Duchy of Carinthia is, of course, like a part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was known in Latin as Ducatus Carinthiae, in German as Herzogtum Kärnten, and in Slovene as Vojvodina Koroška. It was located in essentially today's southern Austria and parts of northern Slovenia, so talking the contemporary country's territorial borders. As we will see now, this is just a brief introduction before the dense stuff. The duchy was established in 976, and as such, it was separated as other chunks, in fact, of southeastern Germany from the Duchy of Bavaria. Right? This is the case also for the later Duchy of Austria. This is true for other realities like Tyrol. The same Verona, at some point, northeastern Italy was even part of the bigger district of Bavaria in many ways. Naturally, the sort of unitary government of these lands did not quite exist. Bavaria was the bigger chunk, north of the Alps, that maintained its core land. But the fact that these chunks were separated speaks about the general feudal pattern, of course, emerging after especially the Carolingian Empire of gradual autonomization. The Bavarians were quite powerful. They were the people that basically were expanding in the southeast of Germany toward these areas. They were protagonists of the world from an ethnic, linguistical point of view. But from a political one, with feudalization, there is also now a matter of statehood and how you can stably and territorially organize a dominion over a given land. What's important about the Duchy of Carinthia in this is that by its establishment in 976, it became the first new imperial land, following the original German stem duchies. This is relevant because of also the later medieval districtuation of Germany. It's as if Carinthia now was essentially, as other chunks of Germany, like a stem duchy on its own. And indeed, it had its own peculiar characteristics. It would remain part of the Holy Roman Empire as such, as the Duchy of Carinthia, until Napoleon's secularization in 1806. As you know, most of southeast Germany was taken over by the Habsburgs after the Battle of Markfeld in 1278. I have increasing pressure from from my audience to simply make a series, simply reading, translating from my master thesis about that topic. However, Carinthia is fully ruled by the Habsburgs. We'll see now what were the dynastic issues from 1335 onward. Right? These lands, by the way, always remain detached. Of course, Austria, Styria, Carinthia were separated lands on their own, just feudally assumed as a dynastic possession by the Habsburgs, that would maintain it as a Cis-Lithuanian crown land within the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918. Cis-Lithuanian means from this part of the Leitha River. And by the time of the Carinthian plebiscite in October 1920, the main area of the former duchy had become the Austrian state of Carinthia, the federal state of Carinthia, today's Austria, as well. So, starting with the, it's mostly a feudal history of Carinthia. It's also land that, as you know, does not have like any radical, say, protagonism in the matters of the entire Kingdom of Germany, but it does have a very interesting provincial history with important regional branchings. So, as we were saying at the beginning, in the 7th century, the region of Carinthia, that would become of Carinthia, was encompassed by the Slavic Principality of Carinthia that emerged in the latter half of that same century. These were, the gradual Slavic western migrations that normally stopped at the Alps in here, essentially finding the path emptied from the Germans that at large had migrated into western, southern Europe, to the point, this point especially, like the moment of major demographic and agricultural shrinking, right, in the early Middle Ages, to sort of create a hybrid in the eastern part, in fact, of what would have become later on the Teutonic Kingdom. So that, as you know, this frontier areas in parts of Saxony, Thuringia, even Franconia, Bavaria, and these other areas were a bit of a blend of Germans, the majority at large, and the Slavs. Of course, the Germans were by this time already sort of stronger, even in those areas that had not fully been colonized by the Romans and the Franks later on, compared to the Slavic tribes that were at large much looser. However, you also have these principalities that definitely do mean something. We know very few about them, from which we understand that the Slavs had a previous power concentration of at least provincial domains, like this one of Carinthia. Because of the Ostsiedlung, Carinthia came under the control of Duke Odilo of Bavaria, a member of the Agilolfing dynasty who ruled from 737 as Duke of Bavaria until his death in 748. This acquisition, right, at least this conquest, this control, seemingly occurred around 743. We know a few about this as well. Again, the Germans at large had the upper hand over these neighboring Slavic principalities that, again, had just a very loose central authority. Mostly they were different clans, right, ritually electing different rulers, especially in times of war, but not really being able to oppose much stronger cohesion compared to the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. The Bavarian stem duchy would be later, like in a few decades, integrated in the Carolingian Empire when Charlemagne deposed Duke Tassilo III, Odilo's son, in 788. This was Charlemagne's own cousin. You know the story. Bavaria at large tried with the Longobards to establish an axis to escape Carolingian expansionism, but when Carloman died, Charlemagne obtained the entirety of Francia, and as such, basically everything along the upper Danube was overrun by the Carolingians. After all, the Franks had created the Duchy of Bavaria, per se. The Bavary, we will talk about them at large, but they're not like sort of other clean-cut Germanic peoples that migrated from somewhere and reinstalled themselves somewhere. They were a great a conglomeration, let's say, mostly of Germanic, but also Celto-Roman, Slavic elements that the Merovingians decided to compact as a duchy, in fact, not as a kingdom, to stress the subordination to the Franks, but also recognizing the previous lack of a veritable unity and or leadership. Nevertheless, over time, this territory, a bit pressured by the Avars, and in general, like with in a good position over the Danube, controlling important traffics. Think about Salzburg, exporting, in fact, minerals up to Constantinople along the Rhine, to the Black Sea, and Bosphorus, were collecting enough surplus to stabilize, and they routinely could, in fact, subject, especially these weaker Slavic entities in the southeast, because the ones directly in the east that would become, say, Moravia, Bohemia, were already a bit more difficult to subdue, because were slightly more compact, but were also, let's say, more distant from civilization. Ideally, the Bavarians wanted instead to control, especially the Alpine arc, which also the Slavs from the other side, as we've seen, had stopped to. So there was, like, from one side were ideally at least the Germans, and from the other side the Slavs, but just by relative majority, as there is a deep blend of these populations since the migration era in these specific areas. So Bavaria is now within the Carolingian Empire, and what would become Carinthia was fundamentally subsumed into the system accordingly. The Bavarians also were very interested in, say, at least the Carolingian, mostly Eastern Franks, were interested in controlling northeastern Italy, mostly the frontier with the Byzantine Empire in places like Istria, and with the Slavs, we've seen how, for example, the Duchy of Croatia came to be. So it's a very often blurred picture that corresponds to an equally sort of unstable profile of these local polities that only gradually come into being. The fateful Treaty of Verdun, which concluded the Carolingian Civil War and partitioned the empire among Lothar I, Louis II, and Charles II in 843, placed Carinthia within the territory of the newly born East Francia under King Louis the German. This kingdom did not exist before, and so again, this is the moment in which Bavaria is also now more framed into the Eastern Kingdom. I made a video about Louis the German that, of course, was much more interested in recovering essentially West Francia, because it was still feasible at the time, than caring mostly about this eastern frontier. Remember, the Avars had been crushed by the Carolingians downriver, and the Slavs had been in part freed from the subjection to that, essentially, at least in origin, Turco-Mongol power. And that was, generally speaking, a pretty unstable frontier. At least it was militarily active. The Bavarians were a bit, also in the following centuries, the unsung heroes of, say, the wars against the Magyars, for example, that eventually were mostly sung by the Ottonian, the Saxon propaganda, like literature. Nevertheless, we will make another video about Louis the German, talking more about this space. This part of Carinthia was not, again, too active. Mostly, the Bavarians were trying to link up, right, with areas like Friuli, so properly in the Italic kingdom, that were in fact more stable, civilized, etc., and essentially along the Alps on the northeast towards places like Vienna, Passau, and so on, which is ideally what the Holy Roman Imperial boundaries will succeed in doing, like compacting especially this area as a German one. Between 889 and 976, the area of Carinthia was referred to as the Carinthian mark. We will see in those other chapters how also the term came to be, like when it was first documented and how it essentially derived from the Carinthania. The Carinthian mark was established by King Arnulf of East Francia in 889, comprising the region of Carinthania. Because there were two different things. I mean, feudal districts of post-Carolingian Europe and the previous tribal principalities that had emerged from their migration era are not territorially the same identical thing. The boundaries are changing. In the meanwhile, they will keep, in fact, expanding in this case from the German side. Prior to becoming a mark, the territory had been already organized as a county under Bavarian jurisdiction since 828. This tells you how relatively poor the area was, meaning that counties normally in post-Roman Europe are, but also in general post-Carolingian one, are local districts, like normally the centers of a diocese, and in fact a comitatus revolving around a civitas or a burg of some sort, right? So the area of Carinthia now, and even just Carinthania, was substantially larger than that on average, but it was enough to be controlled by a single count, right, within a previous mark as well, and this broader, in fact, eastern frontier of Bavaria, signifying there weren't so many forces agitating within this territory. You can imagine, pretty sort of scarcely populated at large, yet to mostly colonize, to clear, to reclaim, etc. territory. By the way, going on, you have this crucial figure, the Count Berthold of the Luitpolding dynasty, from which the later Babenberg will also stem, being granted ducal rights by the Eastern Frankish king Henry the Fowler in 922. It's a very important passage because this territory, albeit not being yet recognized as a stem duchy on its own, is provided with a ducal authority, which is superior to the comital one. So it's essentially a provincial scale power, which also signifies how during these generations Carinthian power had expanded through German colonization, general repopulation of this territory, also for strategic reasons against the Magyars, for example. I made a video about Henry the Fowler recently, and you can see there a bit of we talk about, in fact, Berthold of Carinthia and the broader game that the king of Germany was involved with in trying to stabilize, if anything, these territorial duchies. So you understand that also in the eyes of Henry the Fowler, that surely knew a thing or two about Eastern Frankish rule as a whole, Carinthia was destined to become a provincial asset on its own. Berthold was the younger son of Markgraf Luitpold of Bavaria and Kunigunda, the sister of Duke Erkanger of Swabia. Just to speak about also the high, of course, nobility that could rise to such power, he ascended to the dukedom of Bavaria in 938 after succeeding his nephew Eberhard. So he scales up, and he was already within that ducal environment. But now he holds double title in that way. After Berthold's death in 948, the Luitpoldings, despite being heirs to the royal Ottonian dynasty, could not retain their possessions, as King Otto I ensured the loyalty of his brother Henry I by granting him the Bavarian lands, which was a particularly strong imposition. Otto would face many revolts because of his sort of authoritarian molding of the empire, but that was also, in fact, this royal power affirming itself ever more on these provincial realities, really. The Renovatio Imperii, heralded by the Saxon house, was really based on this quite brutal, pragmatic means. Henry I's son was Henry II, the Quarreler, right? The guy that eventually would become the last Ottonian to rule as an emperor after the death of his nephew Otto III. This was essentially the Bavarian branch. It was the Saxon one, and this is the parallel Bavarian one that, in fact, also harbors some hostility, or at least competition, towards their actual also hostility, but in general towards Saxony. Two different worlds. Consider that Bavaria had been in Carolingian times the actual center of East Francia, right, and Saxony was sort of a newcomer, but things had also changed in the meanwhile. And the reason why Henry is called the Quarreler as well is that he initiated a revolt, in fact, against his cousin Emperor Otto II, beginning in 974. As a result, he was ousted as Duke of Bavaria in favor of Otto's nephew, Duke Otto I of Swabia. Concurrently, Emperor Otto II created a sixth duchy alongside the original stem once, establishing, at this point, the new Duchy of Carinthia in a fully parallel way to the other stem duchies in East Francia. This is essentially the foundation of the Duchy of Carinthia proper in political and institutional continuity. Because even though, as we've seen, the ducal title already existed, that happened in a time, like the first half of the 10th century, where when you look at post-Carolingian Europe, in all the kingdoms, we've seen it for Burgundy, we've seen it for certain Italian realities, the emperor, the king, could bestow like the title of count or duke, but as terms were still sort of classically intended titles, like some stemming mostly from our Romano-Germanic quasi-tribal migration era phase, where a task like the one of the same king was temporary, where the idea was that for now, I'll give you this title because there is an emergential situation, but fundamentally I can change it. I can make you more. Normally, Duke was a title more reserved to someone provided with a stronger military power, right? Whereas Count was something a bit more Roman, a bit more historically Frankish, but in fact in a safer heartland, right? And when you look at the Bavarian tradition, the Longobarд tradition, you realize that the title of Duke was a bit more out there. At this point, 976 instead, Carinthia is attached the duchy, the ducal authority for good in her history. Throughout the centuries, the region known as Carinthia, Carentan, gradually superseded its earlier designation of Caranthania, together with the local Slavic dialects that were gradually, in fact, taken over by Bavarian, by German. The territory originally governed by the Carinthian dukes extended over a large area, as we observed before, incorporating the marches of Styria, the Marchia Carantana. I made a video about medieval Styria, you can look at for more information in this, Carniola, as well, so roughly today's Slovenia, and Istria, the Istrian Peninsula, on the Adriatic as well, plus the Italian Mark of Verona to the south, right? This is really important because it shows, from one side, how the need for a unitary Carinthian power authority had existed even before the establishment of the duchy at the time of Henry the Fowler, but how in a relatively short time, at least like some generations, Carinthia was seen so politically and strategically important to nominally extend as a feudal authority over a very wide territory, essentially securing this belt, as we were saying before, between what would become Austria's sort of the more and better controlled Eastern Mark, and even northern Italy, part of northern Italy. Naturally, this stemmed, we'll see now, essentially from a general need of coordination, like nobody, even including, as we've seen, the broader Duchy of Bavaria, that also encompassed this enormous territory, was not really unitarily run. There was, if anything, cooperation on these various lands, some of which were especially different from one another, that, however, was aimed at reinforcing the belt that went from northeastern Italy to the Danube. In fact, most of the later, eventually this extension would fade, and there would be many characters that had both the titles of margraves of Carinthia and of Verona at the same time. Despite of the fact, by the way, there were other people ruling in other places, like, in fact, saying northeastern Italy and so on, but at least ideally as a projection of feudal power during the Ottonian era, this kind of game was established, mostly to have a more coherent response to the Slavic, Byzantine, say, attempts to destabilize the area within Istria, for example, that was a very hotly contended land. Consider at this point the Magyars have already been crushed by the Saxons and also finished off further by the Bavarians in terms of, at the same time, mostly, even before battles like Riade and Lechfeld. However, when you look at Henry the Younger, so the son of Berthold the First, sort of full Duke of Carinthia, this was both the first and last duke from the Luitpolding family, as Henry the Third. His attempt to support the failed war of the three Henrys, a short-lived revolt involving three German princes, all named Henry, who resisted Emperor Otto II between 976 and 977, which concluded with a peace settlement in 978, resulted in his loss. He was one of the Henrys, in his loss of control over Carinthia 2 years later. Otto I, Otto of Worms, that was the emperor's nephew from the Salian dynasty, succeeded Henry the Younger. Even though Henry reclaimed the ducal title in 985, Carinthia fell under full imperial jurisdiction upon his death in 989. This is interesting because it shows you, of course, how the peripheral Carinthian location could bring to further inspirations from the side of these houses that still reason, especially in the fringe of the empire, in terms of personal possession, of sort of oligarchic autonomy, but things were to take another direction. Not without Carinthia maintaining her own identity, though, and her own peculiarity. Right? It's a very, we'll talk about Carniola as well, but Carinthia is really the last sort of southeasternmost power, so the corner of the Eastern Frankish kingdom in an area that is per se quite exposed, quite distant, and and must essentially maintain an important degree of autonomy. We've seen it was still true during the Renaissance, where they had to ask the Austrians to send more troops also to protect the Slavonian frontier that they contributed to help on their own against the Ottomans. A very interesting reality. In 1012, Count Adalbero I of Eppenstein, who had been the margrave of the Carinthian Mark, so what would be the later Styria, so it was in the era, as you understand, since around the turn of the millennium, as well as margrave of Verona from roughly the same period until 1035, was appointed duke by the last Ottonian emperor Henry II. That ruled from Bavaria, by the way, and at the same time the Istrian mark was delineated and bestowed upon Count Poppo of Weimar-Orlamunde. This was the margrave of Istria from 1011-1012, and of Carniola as well from 1040 until his death. So you see this belt, Carinthia, Carniola, and Istria do remain in part connected, just out of practical reasons. Because at large, yes, these were different provinces, but the need to make this frontier solid was, and just the general power of certain local houses rendered them as a whole, or at least handled as a whole. Just, by the way, picture early 11th century Carinthia. I mean, how it could have been. Like, it's just a very sort of fairy tale, forested, mountainous area, like, scarcely populated one today. Just imagine, even in the forma mentis of this ruler, of the people that lived under them, etc., what this world could be, right at the fringe between like the Hungarian, the Slavic, the German, the Italian world, the Byzantine one as well. Adalbero was ousted in 1035 from his Carinthian mark after losing favor with the Salian Emperor Conrad II. I made a video about his life and times, if anything. Very important emperor, we'll have to come back on. In 1039, Emperor Henry III, Henry the Black, inherited Carinthia as an imperial fief. All right. And he severed, at this point, the Carniolan mark in the following year, granting it to Margrave Poppo of Istria. So at this point you see another imperial authority intervention that tends to divide instead, also because gradually these places are becoming more populated, stronger, so they can be handled by different rulers at a time, including these that again had a grip already on the local situation, knew how to handle it. In 1077, the Duchy of Carinthia was given to another member of the Eppensteiner lineage, though, Luitpold, typical Bavarian name in the sense, witnessed the extinction of his family following the death of his younger brother Henry III of Carinthia. There was also the Margrave of Verona since 1090, so you see this some, at least, of titles remaining at large, like Carinthia and Verona especially were the most important of these lands around, unlike Styria and Carniola and Istria. So that was the favored branch, the favored house. Henry III died in 1122. Following Henry's demise, the Duchy of Carinthia shrank further as a considerable segment of the Eppenstein territories, located in what is present-day Upper Styria, was transferred to Margrave Ottokar II of Styria, who was the offspring of Ottokar I and the grandfather of Ottokar III from the Ottokar dynasty. We've seen this well in medieval Styrian video. This was a more internal area. It was severed from Carinthia. During the investiture controversy, Henry the Younger, Henry III, had sided with the papacy, leading to a dispute with his sibling Adalbero that had instead supported the emperor, who died in 1086 and 1087. After the demise of Henry III, as we said, the Eppensteiner family became extinct, and that's where, in fact, Ottokar took over their lands in the Moor and Meuse valleys. And in 1108, he established a Benedictine monastery in Garsten, Upper Austria. Today, the remaining portion of Carinthia was passed down from Duke Henry III to his godson, that was Henry, from the House of Sponheim, that originated in Rhenish Franconia. This tells you, by the way, how coveted such provinces in southeastern Germany were, because mostly of their rapid expansion, as we've seen, they weren't so more like a frontier area, right? With a lot of potential, you have to work hard, but it can be quite remunerative. As we've seen here, for example, Styria had separated into another entity on its own. That initial Ottonian unity, or at least extension of Carinthian power over other territories, had faded. The same actually would be more or less in the same decades for Bavaria as a whole, right? In the 12th century, Austria is detached from it. You see also these patrimonial policies, including the foundation of monasteries, establishing a full sort of dynastic state. This is, by the way, the age of it in the 12th century. Gradually, Germany fully feudalizes, also in this eastern frontier, through the inputs from the West that favor the establishment of more outlined courts and so on. We'll see that also southeastern Germany does spread further these models. The House of Sponheim started ruling in Carinthia with the Duke Henry IV, who reigned from 1122 until his premature death the next year, however. The most distinguished member of the House of Sponheim was Duke Bernhard, notable as the first Carinthian duke to be officially recognized in documents as Prince of the land. This is a further evidence of what we're just saying, not just there is a final sanction of Carinthia as a stem duchy on its own, but now the princely and territorial seigneury of the House of Sponheim, in the sense of the House of Carinthia, is confirmed also by our available historical documentation. It's never random, right? Even when you think, like, when would we have the first evidence or this or that, it's never like, I don't know, the time at which it would seem unlikely, but in the moment in which this is expressed in a way also by the contemporaries, right? It's not an accident. It's really them wanting us to know, right, as much as possible, that they sort of had fully established that by that time, and reiterating it, of course, not thinking about us specifically, but mostly showing off at the time in display of this power. And Bernhard was an all-round courtly figure. He was a supporter of chivalry and Minnesang, so in the typical knightly, religious, cultural, literature style of the time. I would like to make a video about the Minnesang because they really incarnated a extraordinary knightly and literary model. You would be surprised how these people, habituated to butcher a large number of human beings for a living, could artistically express themselves in that sublime fashion. Remember that the peak of male creativity is also the one of male crime, for that matter. And everything was channeled, was funneled into this feudal culture, affirming prepotently on this also incredibly brutal frontier, even when frontiers are as usual, not particularly active in absolute terms. We've seen it recently with other frontiers, including North America during the 7 Years' War. So there's small engagements, right? They don't make big news at large. But this doesn't mean that in relative terms, at an individual local level, things are not brutal. Actually, they're often much more brutal, right? Because the situation is much more precarious and intense. The last Duke of the Sponheim, or Sponheim, that depends on the document, Ulrich III, so roughly 1220 up to his death on October the 27th, 1269, so the full age of chivalry and feudalism, governed the lordship of the Mark of Carniola from around 1249 and held the title of Duke of Carinthia from 1256 until his death, marking the conclusion, in fact, of the Sponheim leadership. His tenure had significant impacts. In Carniola, he obtained the previous Meranian territories and was recognized as the first indisputable princeps terrae. So yet another, confirmation of a territorial lordship, like a provincial lord, laying down the legal and power systems for future governance in Carniola as well. Carniola was a weaker power than Carinthia. It could sort of easily subsume that. In fact, the focal point of his early Carniolan lands was the same Ljubljana, that is today's Slovenian capital, transformed into the administrative center and provincial one, becoming the epicenter of Ulrich's authority. In Carinthia, which he inherited after his father's demise, his seal evolved into the contemporary coat of arms of Carinthia, which you may want to notice that are the three black lions put one above the other on golden background. We know this because he actually had the previous Sponheim coat of arms, the black dragon, on a white background, but during his reign, he had this other seal issued, and this is in fact what still stands on the Corinthian coat of arms. The dragon was better. In fact, that's the one I used here for Carinthia at large, at least remembering this main phase of autonomous power under the Sponheim dynasty before the Bohemian and the Habsburgic takeover, right? There is here, of course, a quickly evolving international picture, because in spite of this provincial autonomy, the bigger states neighboring Carinthia are much stronger than it. There was a great effort, as you know, to secure the extensive Babenberg inheritance that we discussed in the video about the Duchy of Austria, but we will surely have to come back on because it's a very important topic. Austria had been skyrocketing during the 13th century. The Babenberg had established one of the best feudal administrations in Europe. Austria was the envy of all the other German princes. Everybody wanted to seize it, the Hohenstaufen, the Przemyślids, even the Hungarians, they called even Ruthenian prince. That was all the issue of the heiresses, right, to the Babenberg fortune. This mostly, in fact, passed through matrimonial alliances, initially with Agnes of Merania, the widow of the last Babenberg Duke Frederick II of Austria, and later with Frederick's niece, Agnes of Baden. They had the same name, but they had married different guys. In this, Ulrich III of Carinthia remained without heirs himself, and even with the backing of the Habsburg King Rudolf I of Germany, who defeated Ottokar II at battle on the Markfeld in 1278, Philip of Sponheim failed to gain actual power on its own. So following a brief nominal interregnum by him, Philip was the Patriarch of Aquileia at the time, and he was the last, member of his dynasty, with whom, in fact, the House of Sponheim died out. So that all of Ulrich's properties were inherited by his cousin, Ottokar II of Bohemia, having been defeated and killed in 1278, relinquished all this to the proper king of Germany, king of the Romans, Rudolf of Habsburg. Right, this was the moment in which, in fact, the Habsburgic house takes over the Duchy of Carinthia. Even before the Patriarch of Aquileia, Philip, passed away, in fact, a year later. So, main branch died out. They had essentially backed the Habsburg against the King of Bohemia, that, as you know, had previously taken over the entirety of southeastern Germany, including like arriving up to the Adriatic, seizing places like Pordenone and Margarius. So, recompacting part from Bohemia and Moravia, this further, let's say, Germano-Slavic territory, that, however, wouldn't hold. Rudolf of Habsburg obtains his clamorous victory with the help of the Hungarians as well against Ottokar, who was killed in combat. And in the following years, fief after fief, the king of the Romans fully secures for his own house, because we are in princely Germany now. I made, as you know, multiple videos about it after the interregnum. Secures like this and through his children mostly. He let's say the German princes would have not tolerated Rudolf becoming the ruler of Austria still nominally, right? So he took Austria for himself, but he distributed these other territories to his children that he had to struggle a bit to juridically secure in that feudal landscape. Then they had parts of Swabian territories in their ancestral lands. But Carinthia is essentially the first one to be fully, after Austria, to be fully secured, because the fact of a dynastic extinction, right? The path was not entirely smooth, though, because it went more or less like this. Like, the king of the Romans, after having defeated the Permislids, initially granted Carinthia to Count Meinhard II of Gorizia-Tyrol. We are in 1286. So he could grant it simply as King of Germany, right? And the reasons are there a bit complicated. We talk about Tyrol. We have to talk about the County of Gorizia. That is also a very interesting polity there. And this concession had been done to also there stiffen some kind of presence, co-opting this provincial rulers, so that Meinhard would get Gorizia-Tyrol plus Carinthia and the adjacent Mark of Carniola. Not a bad territory. The Gorizia-Tyrol house was very important in these decades, thanks to this sum of power. In 1335, after the death of Henry, the last male of this lineage, who held titles as Duke of Carinthia and Landgrave of Carniola as Henry VI, Count of Tyrol from 1295 until his death, and also serving as King of Bohemia, Margrave of Moravia, there is all that story there, even titular King of Poland from 1306 and again from 1307 until 1310, Emperor Louis IV of Wittelsbach allocated Carinthia and the southern section of Tyrol as an imperial fief to the Habsburgs on May 2nd in Linz. This is relevant because essentially this was a power-sharing situation between now the more important provincial houses in Germany. The Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs, now soon the Luxembourgs. I recently made a video also about Charles IV, that would come a bit later, but still against Ludwig of Bavaria, were the major famous powers there, and they had to delimit at least their sphere of influence. And at least Carinthia was from the other side of the Alps, from Italy. So Ludwig was mostly trying to secure his passage through that, but he had less reach. From Bavaria, but from Carinthia, like the Habsburgs only could easily control those territories. They had allies in there. There was an attempt to co-opt also the northern Italian Ghibelline seigniories. First of all, Verona and the La Scala, that were imperial vicaries, they were also married into the German royal house. That's where the County of Gorizia is also very important, because these are used as proxies by the Habsburgs to infest, in fact, the Venetian area, where also Ludwig of Bavaria would like to exercise some control. Intervene, for example, against Padua. There are lots of interesting, actually to safeguard Padua against the Veronese, but if actually take it over, also Cangrande is not very happy with that. But just for saying which kind of channel, like what kind of function now these territories had. Like, then, as we've seen, they had always been associated more or less with Verona, like, the general theater, like, of political interaction, etc. But they were continuing now on a much more dynastic princely basis, which is typical of the period. In any case, after Ludwig of Bavaria finally bestows the Duchy of Carinthia to the Habsburgs, these continued to govern the land until 1918. Right, so it's one of those territories that, as we've seen, Rudolf had secured pretty early on in a general political direction. They had inherited them essentially from, even as just an imperial thieves. This is the magic of imperial thieves, that if somebody gets extinguished, there are no heirs. The emperor gets them, right? And can decide whom to give it. And at this point, however, the Duchy of Carinthia is fully now absorbed, subsumed. It's part of the big tree, the sort of magic tree, Austria, Styria, and Carinthia, as aligned as very core lands of the effective the Habsburgic Alplanda proper. So I made some videos also about the early modern period, if anything the 16th century. So if you're interested in seeing how the system worked, how Carinthia fared at the time, of course it would never become this enormous power. It was at this point simply subsumed by a much greater provincial, actually now regional power, like the Habsburgs in southeastern Germany. In fact, Carinthia, similarly to other regions within the Habsburgic dominions, functioned still as a semi-autonomous territory, of course, in a feudal framework. You have your own constitution that allowed the land, in fact, to maintain such status, such identity over the centuries. The Habsburgs partitioned their lands within the family twice, as you know. There are three branches. There are three distinct branches of the Habsburg at some point in the second half of the 14th century. In fact, it greatly depletes their power that had initially, even you've seen with the Tyrol, the Gorizia-Tyrol, there were some individuals that had even managed to get other crowns elsewhere. Also, the less known thing is that the Habsburgs, as well, in the aftermath of the Battle of Marketlis in the following decades, did get the nominal crown of Poland. Right at the beginning of the 14th century, especially, they had a monstrous power that could have remained intact, and instead they somehow lose for different reasons. The assassination of Albert, there are a lot of misfortunes, different battles that they lose, for example, against the Bavarians. Frederick the Fair will be captured in battle against the same Ludwig of Bavaria. That's also how the Habsburgs would not get the imperial title up to very late, because King of the Romans is virtually dead, but without Italian expedition, you're not Holy Roman Emperor, right? Well, for example, Ludwig of Bavaria does, the Luxembourg Henry VII does also. His grandson, as we saw in the recent video about Charles IV. And this Habsburgic partition occurs first by the Treaty of Neuburg in 1379. Again, it will happen actually in the second half of the 16th century. That was a moment of utter Habsburgic crisis / fragmentation. And on these occasions, the Duchy of Carinthia was basically integrated into what was understood as Inner Austria, and jointly ruled with the neighboring duchies of Styria and Carniola, that were basically now to act as a single, almost as a single entity. Because literally, that's why I say that the Middle Ages stopped in 1918 at the latest, because they would remain separated up to then, really, even beyond, right? However, these partitions would bring to Inner Austria was fundamentally separated from Austria, from the Duchy of Austria, and also from Upper Austria, that was constituted by, essentially, think about the county of Tyrol and the adjacencies in the Central Alps, basically, right? And so you have Austria with upper, say, Austria proper, right? So before the N River, confluence with the Danube, and the lower Austria, and then you have, in fact, the Inner Austria with the Duchy of Styria, Carinthia, also the County of Gorizia, as a matter of fact, the Duchy of Carniola, and even parts of at least the County of Gorizia. Here we're talking mostly about feudal conglomerates. So we're talking about dependencies of other historical feudal districts that would control parts of Istria as well. Also places like Trieste, for example. And so, like, you have mostly these lands following different paths. Say that Inner Austria is a bit like the B series Southeast Germany compared to Austria. And this is basically it. Like, as you understand, it's not an overwhelmingly long or detailed history. We could get into that. I'm sure that for that matter, like, this historical regional series mostly focuses on the highlights of the major sort of political issues, mostly how these dominions came to be from a territorial point of view. Like, when was that land annexed, or, you know, what happened to this very land, under whom was it? We've seen it, right? More or less what strikes you about we looked a lot about the Holy Roman Empire. There's a lot to compare, but it's more. This happens at large all across Europe. There's a moment of genesis, we could so say, in the early Middle Ages. In the higher Middle Ages, there is the boom of the districts, and then in the later Middle Ages, unless you are the actual power, you're taken over by actual power. And you become a dependency, mostly emptied of your previous autonomy. So it is a very interesting picture, and I'm sure we will make more videos about this stuff, because it's I'm checking how much we've made about medieval. I haven't made a playlist yet about medieval Germany, just medieval German lands. We could actually make one, because at this point, you know, playlists are really infinite. Wow, we get actually lots of views, this playlist. I'm glad, because these, you see here, Styria. Yeah, well, there is a lot of attention. I would like to make more about medieval Germany that can really get into, especially the depths of this feudal intricacies, because many of you watch this stuff and say, oh my god, it's so complicated. Yeah, it is, right? I would think Germany has actually, maybe some aspects maybe of communal Italy may seem more complicated, but actually the German ones are more, if anything, more intricated. That's the point. I mean, in terms of complications, maybe the bigger systems are actually more complicated to, if anything, to research, to study. Also, Germany as a whole is overwhelmingly complicated. There's nothing compared, say, to England or France, because there is at least a relative unity that you can appreciate quite early on, and so things get compacted much more quickly. Here, as you know, we've seen it often also for modern history, etc. Like, things are enormously complicated, to say the least. And as such, I think, however, they're more interesting. I mean, if you really want to understand the history of these countries, you must come to know them like this. You can't think there is another way to do so. And that's why I make this series, because I think it's really hyper interesting just to look at all the various territories and realizing how they intertwine. Because if it were just for them on their own, it's difficult sometimes to trace any particular identity. Like, even when you have this, of course, local. If anything, if I made a video about, for example, linguistic history, would be different, because there you could hear how, for example, I don't know, Carinthians speak as opposed to Styrians, you can say Carniolans, because of course, like, those speak Slav at large. But this is also interesting. It habituates you to some sort of to the differentiation of these territories, mostly from a political point of view, also from a matter of estate. You see here, if we talk high medieval Germany, it's obviously a feudal history. It's that dynastic history. It can't be otherwise. Like, if you were to talk about, I don't know, the Baltic hinterland, it's that a tribal history. Like, it's different. And so, again, I'm always glad when we discuss this stuff. I try to be always complete, because you can't truly escape from this all. I mean, the complexity may be terrifying. I'm looking at all these videos and say, was so crazy to get into this and to actually come of it alive, or wanting to know the same ways. But telling the truth, there is a lot to know, and I'm sure that we will make other videos explaining much better this history, because it's in many ways say it's more educational at large. Like, I think that if you want to really appreciate the complexity of it, you have to get to the individual stories, what these people were doing, because that adds a layer of depth that you can't really find elsewhere in the same way, right? It's just going to be much more different at large. Very well, for today, I stop it here. We'll also get some more pictures, because I notice here that, if anything, I try, as you've seen, to alternate landscapes also with pictures of this strictly historical stuff, because I think that, I mean, this is the beauty of this series, that it's about the real places. It's about the real deal of how these lands were run by and organized. So it's, but if you see the places that also to some extent remained largely unchanged, you can fall in love better with the spirit of the country. All right. For the rest, we will keep talking surely about Carinthian history in other videos. For today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.